Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories. Welcome back to So Here's My Story. I'm Jody.
I'm Elliot.
And we have a couple cool things I want to mention before we get started.
Okay.
You're like, really?
Really?
No, two wonderful things. So two shout outs to listeners. Haley Turpening. I hope I'm saying your last name right, Haley. But she messaged us something really funny that I wanted to share. I don't know if you saw this one, but so she introduced her manager to our podcast, and he proceeded to come in late for a meeting with almost like 10 people because he was listening to an episode and he wanted to finish it and he was sitting in his car.
Nice.
Which I love that. I don't know. It's not that I want to make people late, but
I do. I'd like to contribute to a lack of promptness and productivity.
So thanks for passing on the podcast, Haley. There's nothing we love more than when people pass on the podcast to other people.
Absolutely.
Not only because it's more listeners, but because it's actually just really endearing that it feels worth passing on. So pass away.
Thank you.
Another cool thing happened. We can sort of welcome our newest member to the Facebook group, Steve Edgerton, who interestingly, and this is the funny part of the story. So I will only ever be able to call him Edge because that's how I met him. So he is actually a friend of mine. But the really funny thing is he didn't realize that. So he
didn't realize you were friends. Because that's a little bit
He
disturbing.
doesn't know we're friends. I just follow him around. He's the first person I've ever stalked. No. Here's what happened. So a while back, he subscribed to the podcast out of that. And we've all done this, want to help out a friend, want to support a friend, do the right thing kind of thing. So he subscribed to the podcast, but then didn't listen to it right away. And then did start listening to it at some point. And when we mentioned the Facebook group, he decided to jump in. And it wasn't until he saw my picture that he's like, hey, that's my friend Jody.
I know her.
So welcome to the Facebook group, Steve. Or Edge.
Edge.
I really it feels weird to call him Steve, but anyway, welcome. It's good to have you. And it's especially nice to know that you jumped in, not just because you're my friend, but because you actually liked it. So that's this is like self-congratulatory intro section, I guess. Nice.
It should be a regular feature.
I like it. It's nice. So. Wow,
okay.
I'm babbling. Why don't you take over now?
All right. Well, right now, I'm going to thank our sponsors, Tom Loveland at Mind Over Machines, Cat's Copy, the architecture firm of GWWO, and Marycraft Staffing and HR Solutions.
All righty. Well, then I'm going to jump into the story.
You have a story.
I do.
Okay. Go ahead.
So here's my story. On Valentine's Day, I don't think we've talked about this. On Valentine's Day, at the ripe old age of almost 45, I had my very first car accident.
Yes. Well, we did talk about the car accident.
Did we talk about the car accident? Yeah. I can never remember what we've talked about already or not. So I had my car accident. I took myself guitar shopping that day because it was the next day that I was just a little frazzled by it. I could tell I just wasn't on my game. So I went guitar shopping. And I had a really interesting experience, and it made me think of something that I've noticed is a thing across the board. So I don't know a lot about guitars. And so first of all, there's sort of that intimidating experience of you're trying to shop for something that you don't even know what you're looking at or what you're looking for. And there was this really, both places that I went, there was someone who was super helpful and was very willing to show me around and give me suggestions and stuff. But it was fascinating. And some of the, when they said how much do you want to spend? I could answer that question. But there were all these other things that it was so interesting because and this is the point I wanted to get to. There were things that I didn't have the vocabulary to ask the questions or answer them, or they would ask me things and I didn't even know what words to use. I would have a question. It's not that I didn't even know what to ask. I would have a question, but then I would struggle to convey the question because I wasn't sure what the right words were. And in the same way that, I remember when I first took physics class, I think it was, and you realize that there's a difference between velocity and speed. Mm-hmm. Whereas I used to, previous to that, sort of basically think that they were synonymous. Well, they're not. And if you say speed, it can be very confusing if it's actually supposed to be velocity. You know, they mean something more than what you realize they mean.
Well, if you say speed and you mean velocity and you're talking to a physicist, it can be really confusing.
Right. No, but that is my whole point, yes. Is that words, and so there's the knowing the right words for something has two major pitfalls. And I see this come up all the time in the companies that I work with, where it's one thing if there's just unusual vocabulary that you don't know. So if you're going to go work in a medical department, there's a bunch of words you're going to have to learn. Same, probably your office. If I came to work in your office, there's a bunch of legal words I would have to learn
every day, and in consultations every day.
Yeah. Yes. So that's not really what I'm pointing at here. The really fascinating thing is where there are words, either industry specific words or even more dangerous words we all use all the time that we think are normal words that mean something completely different to other people. So now this is a bummer. I cannot remember the exact words from the guitar shop, but I was falling into these traps. So I would ask a question about it had something to do with the sound or the
So if you say tone or something.
Yeah. Wow, I should have written down exactly what the words were. But it was something like that where, I'd say tone and he would think I meant something else because in guitar world, that word means something and it wasn't what I was trying to mean. And so I just think it's a fascinating thing about how often people, I see this a lot, where someone will say that, that they want, freedom. Well, for some people, freedom comes when you have a certain amount of security. For other people, freedom means flexibility. For other people, it means something completely different. But when you say freedom and everyone in the room goes, oh, I know what he means. And they don't. So so that was the topic that I wanted to bounce around today, is just how problematic words can be and how challenging when you're entering a new environment, either briefly as a consultant or with a new client that you're trying to engage with, or you're starting a new job, how important it is to poke around for the words that mean something here that may not other places.
Well, and I run into this all the time, which is a very low-level example is partnership. I have people come in and say, well, we're partners. And the legal part of my brain is, well, you may be co-stockholders or right. fellow members in an LLC, but partners to me in a legal sense means something completely different.
Yeah.
And if I write an email to them and I say, well, your partner, because I want to speak their language, the alarm bells go off that it's not the correct term. And then I don't want them to think or show it to somebody and think, this guy has no idea what he's talking about because we're not partners, we're stockholders, so, right. So that's part of it. But what I started to do, and now I've gotten fairly adept at it, but it was much later in my career than I care to admit, is start to dispense with the words. And I know this sounds self-serving considering our forum here, or our platform, but focus on the stories. So when I'm having discussions with people, I'll start asking the questions and I'll ask them to tell me a story. Tell me a story of what happens when you two disagree. Tell me a story of when you want to do this and somebody else wants to do that. Tell me a story of how you're going to reach a decision. What's a really tough thing in your industry, and how do you see this meeting turning out when the two of you discuss a strategy?
Yeah. And
so eventually, as we get through, we kind of flesh out the story. I can see how the high points of the story translate into my vocabulary.
Right. Because you're using the story to make sure that you are going to give them a document or whatever you're producing that actually gives them what they want, not accidentally give them the wrong thing because they don't know what words to use. Like they don't know that's the thing. Like they don't know the legal words. Right. So they may come in and say, we want to be partners. But you can't trust that that the language matches up.
No, it doesn't. And there's I'm going to to, this is a spoiler because I'm going to take about 45 seconds and talk about what I know is on your mind as well, because this leads into it, which is an episode of Star Trek. So there was this episode of Star Trek in which they encountered a race of people that spoke the same words, but they only spoke in stories. And so the way they would express themselves is they had this collection of works that was the foundation for their civilization. So if somebody said in the episode was called this, Temba, his arms wide, that would communicate a situation or a feeling or whatever was meant to be conveyed. And the problem that the Star Trek crew had was not that they didn't understand the words, but they couldn't put it in context because they didn't have that foundation of literature.
Right.
And so I find that, see, you didn't think I could make Star Trek relevant, but it's always relevant.
I don't balk that way. And I'll tell you right now, I will mail one of our, so here's my story, whiskey glasses to the first person who can correctly identify the race or whatever you would call it of those alien species in that episode.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
I will up that ante and call forth our Star Trekian listeners, because I bet you someone is listening to this episode and they're like, I remember those episodes. Those were the somethings. Right.
But I think the reverse is true. So you're talking about the reverse, which is somebody will say will say the words, and now my job, this is the way I see it, my job is to translate it into stories.
Right.
So they were starting with stories and you're trying to translate it into words. I like to take their words and translate it into stories so I can figure out, what does this mean to you? What's the import of the words for you?
Yeah, exactly. So because I'll have sometimes I'll meet with someone and they'll say, I want to, and this is a tiny bit different, but it's not. They'll say, I want to grow my business. And I'll say, well, what do you mean grow your business? Mm-hmm. Well, I want to, and they think they'll say like, oh, I want to get bigger. I'm like, well, why? And you talk through, and if sometimes you get through, it's interesting. What they really want is to be making more money. And there's a big difference between profit and growth. And in fact, a lot of times if you're growing, it's usually at the sometimes temporary, sometimes not, detriment of profit. It actually often reduces profit. So getting, and that's not just purely a vocabulary. That's an understanding of business strategy too.
It is. I think it's very important because when I have, going back to my conference room, when I have a group of people and they're all united in the belief that they want to grow their business, for some that means they want hundreds of employees and they want to have an annual meeting that's at, 4 times the space in the Radisson, and they want, their office in Racine, Wisconsin, or wherever they want it. And for some people, they're like, no, I just want our profit margin to go from 10% to 40%, or
so I can work less.
I can work less, or I want 15 people as opposed to 5 in our home office. And those are the story. What do you see as the description? What does it look like? What does that growth look like? Tell me a story.
Well, and using these words, growth and profit and revenue and whatnot, that is kind of back to where just simply the words can be such a challenge. Is when I'm facilitating, I have to watch for this all the time, because like, say you have a CFO or an accounting or the financial type of person there sitting at the table, and someone else will, and this is especially true if there's anything even vaguely contentious being talked about, because emotions are higher. So people are less nuanced in their hearing skills, because even if they're getting like a tiny bit defensive of their perspective, not personally defensive, but just that, that they think they're on a different page from someone. And so if someone says, sort of arguing their side of it, well, blah, blah, and they use the word revenue or one of those financial words that means something very specific. Like you were talking about in law, the word partner means something very specific, and they'll use a financial word, and I'll see and I will know. And it's like watching a car crash happen in slow motion. I will know what just happened. This person used a word that person over there thinks means one thing, but I know that person is using it in a more vague, broad, generalistic use of the term. But I can watch that person's eyes glare shut, and they're like, oh no, they think they're arguing this. And I literally have to I'll be like, pause, wait a minute. he just means da da da, right? Yes. And then I see the person relax. I'm like, that word can be so, and a lot of the examples I'm using are very industry specific, like law or finance or whatever. But the thing that is so important about this topic and why I wanted to hit on it is it happens with everyday words all the time. It's like word choice is, and the message here is not to be super careful about your word choice. But when you see someone else have a reaction, that pause of like, wait, what are you reacting to? Because sometimes it's not that they don't disagree. It's just simply that they misunderstand. There was a quote someone told me one time, and I have looked and looked and looked. I've never been able to find it. And I even asked the person who told it to me, and he's like, I don't know. It was some book I read. I can't remember, but it was more eloquent than this, but it was something like, the devil wanted us to not be able to communicate, so he gave us words, was the concept.
Okay.
And it was almost that like words are actually almost worse for communicating than anything else. And it's funny, you've brought up stories. That's why I use metaphor so often, because the metaphor is like, it's hard to miss the feeling of a metaphor. And I can know everyone's on the same page if they all agree about a metaphor of something. If we just use words, I have to work so much harder to make sure that we're all on the same page, because I don't know what movie's playing in someone's head as they hear that thing. But if we've laid out a metaphor that has a feeling, or if I've drawn some, like, you know how much I draw when I'm talking about, I'm literally drawing on the page right now.
Yes.
Those, like, if you draw it, then, which is sort of like a metaphor, it's a vague visual representation of a concept, that it's so much easier to validate than if we're just using words.
You know, one of the most fascinating meetings that I had, and I don't think you were there. It was when I used to have these meetings that called Drinking Things.
You can have fascinating meetings without me?
Well, you were invited. Let's put it that way. You probably snubbed me.
Probably.
But you remember the Drinking Things that I used to have.
I do.
So we had somebody come in, David Lunkin, come in, and he did conversations with Legos.
Yes. Yes.
And the whole thought,
I saw him do that at another thing that I attended. Yes,
it's fascinating. So the whole thought is that your hands are like a very fast search engine for your mind. They work faster. So that each person, here's the theory, each person is given a set of Lego pieces, you know, in the same set of Lego pieces, and you're maybe around a table with 8 people, let's say, and the question is asked, or the challenge is given, build something that represents your best client or your biggest business challenge or whatever. And you might think, in hearing this podcast and hearing this described, wait a minute, I'm giving Legos and I'm told to build my biggest business challenge. But the fascinating part is you'll just start putting things together and thinking, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm doing. Oh. Well, wait a minute.
Look at that.
Look at that. Wait.
Dude, yeah.
Okay. So yeah, and then you're asked to describe it.
Yeah.
And you'll see people. So to give you an example, your biggest business challenge, and you'll see people who might stack something in this precariously high stack. And then you're asked to talk about it. Well, why did you build this? And they'll say, well, because I feel like I'm doing so many things myself. It's all piling up and none of it's on a solid foundation. And they tell a story that exactly shows what they've built. But if you had asked them without the Legos, if you said, what's your biggest business challenge? They'd be like, well, I'm looking for my ideal clients.
Yeah. And you get like this like inane, intellectualized, overthought,
pasteurized.
drab,
Yes.
Pasteurized.
That's what it is. It's just, everything is just pasteurized. And
it is.
But,
and not because we're not trying. It's just you don't have access to it.
Correct. Because the words can really be a prison. And one other example, which is completely opposite, is that I ran into last week, is the problem of titles. Because I had a situation where the question of, did the person on the other side have the authority to agree to this one thing? And my client said, we were all in a meeting, and one of my clients said, the project manager actually said, well, of course he did. He was a vice president. And the president of his company said to me, or said during that meeting, walk into a bank and when you give your money to the teller, she's a vice president. So it was just the different titles. When I was watching, this is another nerd thing, when I was watching Jessica Jones on Netflix, and spoiler alert, you can pause this for 5 seconds if you don't like it, but Malcolm, who's one of the characters, was told by Jessica that she's now, he's an associate. And he looks at her and he said, Is that a promotion? That's great. And he was really happy. Well, in my world, associate is not a promotion. Associate conveys that you're not a partner.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So language means different things in different places. And I think it means different things in different places. It means different things with different people. And so just never assuming that the words someone uses, I mean, this sounds like a huge Pandora's box can of worms to open here. Like, wait, I can't even assume that it feels a little bit like, okay, now there are no facts anymore. Like now you can't trust words. But it's just something to be aware of, especially if you're in a new environment or a new person to be checking in. But going back to David Lunkin for a second, because it's like the perfect way to wrap it full circle. When I saw him do it, before he did some of the ones about your biggest, like more specific, first, he just simply said, build the best tower that you can build.
Oh, okay.
And he said the best tower. And it's fascinating, the directions people go with that.
Right. It goes back to your growth comment as well.
Yes, because some people built the tallest thing they possibly could. Some people built something that was incredibly sturdy and so not this like precariously like really tall and skinny that might topple, but they built this like really solid, could like withstand a hurricane kind of tower.
Some built that were just interesting to look at.
Yes. Some went sort of architectural, like they designed it. Others had like other functionality in this one has a bridge. It has
a wheelchair
room
ramp.
For growth. Yeah, no, exactly. Like people took, and it was just simply best tower. And that to me, so here's a leadership point. Like the number of times I talk to managers and owners and whatnot who are frustrated because they say, well, I told them we had to, build the best tower we could. Well, what does that mean? Like you can't, like if you're having a problem with accountability or follow through or like where you want to be frustrated that people just won't do what you want them to do, so often it's because they've misunderstood your words, not because they're stupid or because you didn't say what you meant, but you have to take the time to say, what do you mean by best tower? Like, and some great advice I've had, which goes back to what you were saying before, is not telling a story like, it doesn't have to be like once upon a time, but paint a picture. Like, if you say, I want to throw the best event in the world, say, here's what I mean by that. When I walk in, everybody has a drink in their hand and there's music playing and the conversation is flowing and there's, the food sort of like being circled around so that no one's like, you're painting this picture of what it means to have the best event.
Well, and there are two things that I can respond to that would lead us off into a whole new episode. But one is...
and we never do that.
Yes. This is a huge problem that I see with email when you try and convey something, because you only have the words. That's all you're stripped down to is the words. You don't even have pitch and tone and facial expression and body language and all that stuff. You just have the words. And that's why there are so many difficulties with that. The second thing is more of an example. So I'm working with Taylor on, and I know this will shock you, but something that's not podcast related.
What?
Yes, I know. What? We're putting together a series of free videos on frequently asked questions for the law firm, whether it's collection issues or whatever. So I'm putting this together with Taylor, and she's working to produce it. And law can be boring anyway. And so just a talking head on a legal concept, it's boring. And so she said to me, well, what do you really want to accomplish with this? And I said, well, there are two things. One is substantively, I want people to be able to learn from it, to have this question answered. But I would like to be able to create it in such a way that somebody watching it would say to somebody who hasn't seen it, but is in my target market, hey, you really have to see this video. So if that's what the end result, you really have to see that. Now, for Taylor, that might mean something completely different. What would make somebody say, is it CGI special effects?
Right.
Does he jump off a bridge?
Right.
Is Black Panther involved?
Right,
you know,
right.
or
do them all naked?
no, that would never engender that reaction. But that's the reaction I want, which is you really have to see this video. And then the conversation that results from that is really much more illuminating than my saying, well, do we all agree that we have to make this kind of interesting?
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And so I think where I kind of want to, I would love to hear if you have sort of any of these stories of when words have gone awry. I would love to hear those. So pop those into the Facebook group or on our on the Facebook page, anywhere you want to, but really the groups where we're doing all the chatting. So,
and I would add one more thing to that, not surprising, which is, not only where words have gone awry, but what did you take from that and how would you change it if you either had to do it over again, or how do you avoid the same thing happening in the future?
Yes, absolutely. Like ways that you make sure you're on the same page, that you actually get, how do you write the glossary? Like, how do you determine, maybe is the better word, discern, maybe is an even better word, discern the glossary of another person or a client or at a new job, or like when you're guitar shopping. Like it took me about half my day just to kind of get the right words so that I could ask the questions that I had. And it was interesting.
And it strikes me that in a podcast where we're emphasizing that it's not only the words that matter, it's another reason that we need to add video.
Yeah.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories. You can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us.
Which
is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.